In an outstanding column published on The Athletic, writer Chuck Mindenhall argued that Conor McGregor versus Donald Cerrone represents the first de-escalation of the Irishman's career since he started winning belts. He called it a, quote, return to ground zero. And not only do I think that's an astute observation, but I also found that it was the definitive insight which explains the appeal of this contest, at least from my perspective. Chuck in the piece detailed how McGregor's career took a series of detours away from the typical path we see in combat sports, and they're well documented. After he beat Jose Aldo, he neglected the division featherweight in pursuit of another title, apparently without any intention of ever defending either belt. He dabbled in boxing because his star allowed it, and then he returned to the UFC a year later to compete for the title he lost through inactivity in perhaps the darkest build-up in promotional history. Now, alone these detours weren't innately damaging, however, perpetual deviations from the norm have a point of diminishing returns, and I feel like he reached that place some time ago. And ultimately, it was alienating in the sense that they eroded away parts of what made him endearing in the first place. And that's disregarding his extracurricular activities outside the cage, which are infinitely more problematic. And while they certainly tie into my overall thesis, I want to first separate the art from the artist, because I think there are two parts to this story which combine to distract from what really matters in this sport, and that's the fight in itself. But as Chuck pointed out in his piece, UFC 246 feels like a return to the common ranks for McGregor, a de-escalation. And while on the surface that might sound like a bad thing, I think that couldn't be further from the truth. But let me explain why. When things turn sour, we often try to revise history to make it look like we're on the so-called right side of things in the first place. But that's not what I'm trying to do here. Nevertheless, when McGregor versus Cerrone was announced, I initially felt somewhat indifferent to it. And I might be in the minority in that regard, but it's true. I quickly realised, however, that the problem wasn't the matchup, but it was actually McGregor himself. Despite his inactivity over the last few years, he's remained a focus of the MMA beat, and even if you tried, you couldn't avoid being inundated by the negative stories surrounding him. Combining that with his latest career escapades and the regression of his persona, I was honestly a bit tired of him. But I won't pretend that his trailblazing was totally unappealing. So I'd be lying if I pretended I didn't enjoy much of what alienated me over time. And that even includes the events you're apparently not allowed to admit you liked in the moment. For example, the Mayweather episode was a farce, and no, not just in hindsight, it was always a farce. But I can freely admit that I conceded to its novelty, at least enough to have fun with it despite knowing that the outcome was all but predetermined by, well, common sense. And you also can't forget about his pair of welterweight scraps with Nate Diaz, one of the best doubles in UFC history, nor his masterful title challenge against Eddie Alvarez, which was perhaps unearned yet felt like something special. And then even the darkness enveloping the Khabib build-up didn't really deter me from relishing their contest, despite being highly critical of much of the flagrant parts of it. With that said, the cracks started to show throughout this run. His bid to expand the boundaries of what a UFC fighter could achieve was both admirable and undeniably entertaining at times, but it didn't always manifest itself in a way that match those qualities. And for that you can look at the brand of psychological warfare that he employed. Don't get me wrong, he consistently pushed the limits of trash talk before, but as his star grew, so did his proclivity to cross the line of decency both verbally and physically. And while I don't need all fighters to follow Stephen Thompson's lead, possibly the nicest guy in the sport, I found that the more McGregor crossed the line, the less entertaining his shtick was, and it got to the point where he became a caricature of his former self. So much so that it reminded me of a phenomenon that often occurs in television sitcoms. There's a trope called the Flanderization effect, named of course after Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, and if you watch that show or almost any long-running TV show, you've likely seen it in action. It's described as the act of taking a single, often minor action or trait of a character within a work and exaggerating it more and more over time until it completely consumes the character. Most always the trait or action becomes completely outlandish and it becomes their defining characteristic. And I think this is kind of what happened with McGregor. And you can see it when contrasting his interviews and press conferences over the years. He's always been somewhat unhinged, but by the time we got to the Khabib fight, that's all he had to offer. The charm and wit that endeared many fans were gone.
This guy TKOs people. When I knock people out, they don't fucking move. You're not. Who the fuck is that guy? Who the fuck is that?
Shut your mouth, mate. You're a doorbox.
I don't want to
smash me, mate. Smash me. Smash me.
I can smash
you say send your send location. Here it is, right here in front of you. I'm right in front of you.
Just for.
Oh, here's my location, you little fool. Right in front of you. Do something about it. Do something about it. Yeah, you'll do nothing.
Perhaps more troubling from a sporting perspective was how he separated himself from the traditional UFC system to such an extent that a significant part of his competitive identity dissipated. And here's what I mean. Before he became a UFC champion, he wasn't actually a far cry from his UFC 246 opponent, Donald Cerrone. Although his career was carefully curated after the UFC realised they had a diamond in their hands, like Cerrone, he was an active fighter and had a penchant for risk taking. And these were essential qualities which helped catapult him to stardom. Aside from some notable exceptions, mainly brought on by injury, he fought every 4 to 5 months. And we all remember the massive gambles that he took. Like when he was scheduled to fight Jose Aldo at UFC 189 for their featherweight title, but an injury forced Aldo out of their contest. So instead he risked that title shot by accepting a fight on 1 week's notice against Chad Mendes, his apparent kryptonite. And then similarly, when Rafael dos Anjos pulled out of their lightweight title fight at UFC 196, he accepted a non-title bout against Nate Diaz at welterweight. Now don't get me wrong, when he became champion I expected a change of approach, because the journey to a world title and actually being champion have competing obligations. Title holders aren't rewarded for risk taking in the same way that contenders are, and the financial stakes that come with being a champion often demand a certain level of prudence. But his shift in strategy was far more drastic than a simple challenger to champion transition, because you might have noticed that 2 of those 3 examples came after he captured his first title. What McGregor did when he became champion was very different. He separated himself from the promotion's typical way of doing business and basically formed a division of his own, paving the way for the super fight era. When he was champion, he didn't defend his title, and strangely it never felt like he would, and at every turn he was looking for the next big blockbuster opportunity. And sure, it was fun when he was successful, but now through his inactivity and the fact that he hasn't won a fight in 3 years, the novelty has worn off. And I know that some people consider the latter statement, he hasn't won a fight in 3 years, an irrelevant talking point, and I get that because in a certain sense I agree. His boxing match is irrelevant, and the only other fight that he had was against Khabib Nurmagomedov, but either way I don't think inactivity is a great excuse anyway. And then there's everything that happened outside the cage, and I actually did a whole video on this topic after he punched a guy in the bar. I'll link it at the end of this video, but that was before the other allegations came out against him. And while they shouldn't be ignored, I'm not going to discuss them today because of a particular grey area that exists in Ireland, but everyone not living under a rock knows exactly what I'm referring to. And even though we should adhere to the presumption of innocence, I wouldn't fault anyone who is put off the fight by the accusations. It's certainly something that plays on my mind. Anyway, the thesis of that piece was that McGregor was losing Irish support mainly because of his indefensible actions outside the cage. And I do stand by that conclusion. I will admit, however, that it is a challenging hypothesis to prove because it's innately anecdotal, but we do have some empirical data to back it up. In 2016, Tenio ran a quote, nationally representative 1,000 person consumer survey looking at the nation's attitudes towards sport, their sporting heroes, levels of participation and impact of sport on the Irish psyche, end quote. And in that survey, McGregor was actually voted the #1 most admired sports star in Ireland, ahead of the likes of Katie Taylor. In 2017, he came in at a respectable second, this time behind Taylor, whose pro boxing career was flourishing after she won 2 titles. But in 2018 and in 2019 he was nowhere to be seen. In 2018, however, he did appear at number 3 on the most memorable sporting events list for his part in the Khabib Nurmagomedov fight. Nevertheless, this illustrates the general public's decline in affection for him, but it's not just that. The studies also hint at why he was such an influential figure to Irish MMA fans in particular. Another metric that they explore is the country's favourite sports, and not once did MMA appear on that list. Not even in 2016 when McGregor himself was considered the most admired sports person in the country. And that shouldn't really surprise anyone because it's still a niche sport. But the fact that an MMA fighter can be the most admired sports person in a country that generally couldn't care less about the sport itself says something pretty notable about that person. You see, I often get questions from people outside the Irish MMA bubble who are curious about how he retained the support of many Irish fans even after everything that went down. And these surveys somewhat complement what I tell them. His hardcore fandom will die hard because he brought their sport to the mainstream. But that doesn't mean that he's kept everyone on side. He's unquestionably squandered the support of many non-MMA fans, you know, the ones who tuned in because he was an Irish sporting hero. And like it or not, he was considered that a few years ago. However, that narrative now simply isn't a reality anymore for most people, and that even includes a large segment of his former hardcore fan base who felt betrayed and even embarrassed by his exploits. But that doesn't mean that they won't be watching, and by the looks of it, he's making a conscious effort to try win them back, which is why I believe this return to the ordinary hasn't necessarily come by chance. In a recent video by the great Mix Molly Whoppery, which I'll link on the end screen screen of this video, he mentioned that he wouldn't be surprised if McGregor's fans turning on him would be a sobering kick up the ass. And while I didn't agree with the entire thesis of his piece, I think he might be onto something with that point. Because not only is the fight itself a return to normality, but McGregor's approach to the game appears to be too. Everything that he's saying and doing publicly seems like an attempt to retcon his missteps and turn back the clock to a time when he charmed his fans. And whether he's being sincere or not, we'll have to wait and see. However, unlike the last few years, he's championing consistency above all else, even promising to stay away from the politics which often kept him out of competition. And in every interview, he publicly challenges himself to stay active, labelling 2020 as a quote season.
For me, I'm back in my old frame of mind. I just want consistency, I want competition. It's what I love to do, you know, to be in that healthy state of mind and in my body also. So that's it, whoever, wherever. Activity is what I'm pursuing, right? So I'm just keeping myself in shape, fresh, focused, and everything will happen through that, off of that.
And while his goals are still lofty as he aims to win titles across multiple weight classes, he's now actively assessing the divisions and considering fights he wouldn't have just a few years ago. And he's even taken an old school approach to media obligations. According to Jim Edwards, he's scheduled to appear at the UFC Media Day for the first time since 2015 when he fought Dennis Seaver. But most importantly, for the first time in what feels like forever, the contest has taken centre stage. And all of the external distractions have been pushed to the side. The event isn't about breaking records or creating history, and it's not about a heated rivalry either. In fact, McGregor's been more respectful than he's been hostile so far. Ultimately, it's about the fight, and after years of that taking a backseat to everything else, I'll take it. Thanks for watching the video. If you got to this point, you must have liked it even a little bit, so if you hit that like button and subscribe, I would really appreciate it. Not only do we make these types of videos on the channel, but we also do a podcast which you might like, so just check it out on the channel. And also, if you do subscribe, hit the bell so you get notified, and yeah, thanks. Enjoy the fights.